Usually, Eva had Tasha tidy up the townhouse while she watched the baby, but the 19-year-old wasn't exactly the best housekeeper, and the place was looking pretty scruffy. Eva loathed housework, but with her budget under scrutiny, she couldn't hire a maid. However, she was terrified of her mom finding fault, so she spent the long weekend before scrubbing her home in anticipation of Irene's visit. Every solid item was dusted. The refrigerator was sanitized. The floors were mopped twice. Ceiling fans were wiped clean. All linens washed and folded. Towels fluffed and hanging in the bathroom, kitchen. Eva knew that Irene preferred to stay in hotels, but she was elated that her mom suggested staying with her for this 5-day visit. Eva wanted to play hostess. She longed to make Irene feel welcomed, and frankly, she wanted her to be impressed that her younger daughter could actually get her shit together. Irene's flight was due to land at 5:14 p.m., and so Eva drove to Detroit Metropolitan Airport to pick her up, Viva strapped in her car seat. Eva drove a 20-year-old Mercedes-Benz, lovingly worn but with a new transmission and transfer case. Both were courtesy of her last serious boyfriend, about 4 years before. Roland was a trust fund baby who opened a body shop. They only dated a year, long enough to redeem some repairs on the car. Irene's flight landed precisely on schedule, and 35 minutes later, Eva spotted her mother standing alongside the terminal, her impeccable Louis Vuitton luggage stacked beside her. She was only in town for Viva's second birthday, not even a full week, but she looked as though she was ready for an excursion on an ocean liner. Her stuff would fill Eva's small car trunk. Irene warmly embraced her daughter and exclaimed with joy as she picked up her grandchild. Viva was wearing a denim dress and perfect white sneakers. Half the time she remembered her grandma, and other times not. After all, she only saw Irene a few times a year. This evening she acquiesced agreeably, allowing herself to be swept into Irene's arms and given a good warm squish. She didn't fuss or pull away. She wasn't talking much, however, so Irene knew not to expect a grandma from the toddler, not yet. As soon as they buckled up, Irene requested, "Dear, can we stop by Eckerd Drugs for a few items?" "Sure, Mom." At the pharmacy, Eva pushed Viva in her stroller, while Irene waltzed up the cosmetic aisles, grabbing Q-tips, vitamin E capsules, other sundries. Eva asked her to grab her a mascara, while she browsed the greeting cards with Viva. Irene wouldn't dream of buying makeup at a drugstore, but her daughter was different. Poppy begged off after playing paddleball at the gym, and Lena was working, so the threesome headed on their own to Greektown. They were seated near the window of the Parthenon, the sights of unruly youth walking the streets, busking and smoking in full view. Their waiter was incredibly distracted by something going on in the kitchen. Eva ordered a rice pudding for Viva, prompting a look from her mother. "It's the only thing she'll eat here other than bread and French fries." Irene refused to take the bait. She asked, "How is your sister doing?" "She doesn't really tell me. She doesn't trust me." "Oh, Eva, I don't think it's about trust. She's had her share of loss, and she sees you raising the baby that maybe should have been hers." Eva stopped while biting into a slice of crusty Greek bread. "How can you say that? I know what I did was wrong, but how could you think of Viva as anything but mine? She is my daughter. I'm a good mom." "You are. I didn't mean that. I just know how much they wanted a child." "I'm surprised you're not staying at Lena's house." The waiter slid their salads onto the table. "I wanted to spend time with Viva." "Gee, thanks." Irene unwrapped the paper slip from around her utensils. She shook her head in light frustration. "I want to spend time with you too, of course, but it's Viva's birthday and I get so little time with her." "Come visit more often, Mom. We'd all like that." "I do my best. I wish you gals would come down to Florida more. It's tough with the studio, the baby. You enjoy travel more than me, I'm afraid." As they ate their salads and bread, turning their attention on and off toward the toddler, Eva also mentioned, "So I invited someone to join us at the barbecue." She focused on her plate, chewing an olive and putting the pit aside, waiting for Irene's response. "Oh, who's that, dear?" "He's my CPA. I think you'll like him." She neglected to mention that he also happened to be Poppy's CPA, or that he was Lebanese. Later at the condo, Irene brought several gifts for the baby from her suitcase. Eva only allowed Viva to open one, knowing that there were more tucked away in her luggage. Let's save some for the party. She was tired. She worked so hard to make the house presentable and to be a gracious host for her mom, but she doubted it was enough. She could see Irene glancing at the corner, probably finding dust bunnies that were overlooked along with cobwebs and moldings, and that stupid stain in the toilet that Eva could never scrub away. She wondered, would she ever feel like a grown-up? Viva was playing with her gift, an Elmo doll, on the living room floor. She ran poor Elmo over again and again with the plastic yellow train, laughing all the while. The child's hair was zapped with static, standing up at the crown and darkening into a warm brown. Her hair had been rather late coming in. Carmen often proclaimed Viva the baldest baby I ever seen. Eva was secretly glad that Viva looked so similar to Benjamin. Viva looked identical, in fact, to pictures of her father as an infant. She had Ben's long limbs and some of the green of his eyes. She even shared his wide smile and the little freckle next to her right nostril. As the toddler grew weary, Eva changed her into a nightie and handed Viva to her grandma. Irene carried the baby to the front room, settling into the rocking chair. Viva allowed herself to be gently rocked, lulled into sleep. After another 10 minutes, Eva whispered, "Shh, I'll take her." And she opened her arms for her baby girl and walked upstairs, laying the sleeping child in her crib in her room. When she returned to the kitchen, she found Irene scooping mint chocolate chip ice cream into 2 coffee mugs. "Where's the Saunders fudge?" Irene inquired, but Eva was already reaching into the refrigerator door for the jar of rich chocolate sauce. They smiled at one another and leaned against the counter, and for a moment the only sound was the perky tink of the spoons against the mugs. "How is Ray?" Eva inquired. Her stepfather retired the year before from his job as a shipbroker. Irene shrugged. "Doing great. Golfing a lot." And they talked about Lena, who they concurred was working too many hours. Irene wanted to know about the studio. She showed Eva photographs of the trip she took to Costa Rica the month before. Lush and tropical and darkly inviting, a mysterious jungle enfolding 2 lily-white retired folks, being waited on by dark-skinned people and expecting it. Eva couldn't understand why Irene and Rayford traveled to feel better about themselves. She suddenly reminded her mom, "Didn't you and Vonda take us to some jungle-themed park down in Indiana or Ohio or something? I seem to remember something." Irene shrugged. "Golly, Eva, that was so long ago." She didn't elaborate, but continued spooning ice cream from her mug. Eva realized in that moment that her mother was really disconnected from her past. She wasn't angry, however. Irene probably had no choice, right? She lost her husband, she let go of her children. She probably needed to relinquish all those memories to protect herself. She felt kind of sad for her mom. Rayford didn't have kids, and Irene's brothers were scattered and distant. No, Eva, Lena, and Viva were all that this woman would ever have. She kissed her mother on the cheek and suddenly noticed the crepiness of her skin, the softening of her face. Irene was getting older, Eva recognized. Of course, she didn't want to be reminded of the past. She wanted to be happy, even if happiness did not look a lot like parenting. Eva thought to herself, well, she has the right to live the life she wants, not the life that her daughters wish that she would live. As Irene washed and readied for bed, Eva offered to sleep on the sofa. She wondered what her husband was doing. She loved her second husband very much and enjoyed his company as much as he did hers. Rayford was a staunch Republican conservative, and having come from a typical Irish Democrat background, she began to come around the past decade or so, in understanding that part of growing older, more mature, was making more informed political choices, beyond the idealism of your youth. She had girlfriends she met up with monthly for lunch. Rayford had old business associates with which he still enjoyed the occasional scotch. He had at least 3 affairs that she suspected but knew nothing of, and she'd had one with a young fitness instructor that Ray hired for her. Irene never especially looked forward to visiting with her former father-in-law, but this was a necessary part of spending time with her children and granddaughter. Beatrice had been much more difficult than her husband, but even in his 80s, Bobby was still a formidable force. Even now, Irene felt that she had much to prove in his eyes. Meanwhile, she stretched out on Eva's bed, looking forward to spending the weekend with her family. She wondered about this accountant who would be joining the family that weekend. She missed her husband and her home, and she remembered her first husband, who was gone now such a very long time. She grew up in one of the toughest neighborhoods in Detroit, near Outer Drive and Chalmers. Her whole childhood she was shaped by the toughest of women. Her mother, her Oma, the ladies in their neighborhood, and the nuns where she attended Catholic grade school. Even her best friend Vonda, a total tomboy, usually decided what the duo would do together. Irene was mortified as a preteen for friends to learn of her father's desertion and horrified that anyone might discover what her mom did for a living. From time to time, Jeanette helped her mama, Greta, with the diner, but the two women rarely saw eye to eye. Jeanette was flamboyant, boisterous, modern, and Greta was a God-fearing and indomitable Lutheran, an immigrant who came to this country when she was a young bride. Jeanette was one of 4 daughters born to Greta and her late husband. All 4 girls were born in America from 1909 to 1918. Greta and her husband were from the Cologne region of Germany. They were expecting their youngest child when her husband was shipped off to Europe for the Great War. The money that Greta received from the government for her husband's death during the Battle of Vittorio Veneto would later be used to purchase the little diner that kept the family afloat for decades to come. Jeanette supplemented her own family's income during the years that her husband, Hank Fallon, was off fighting in the Pacific by becoming a hairdresser. She worked in their house, giving old ladies in the neighborhood rinses and perms, and the young ladies confectionery bouffants that resembled Easter baskets. She did this work right in her kitchen, something that caused absolute agony to Irene anytime a friend, with the exception of Vonda, suggested stopping by. All these tough-ass women who were in charge. In Irene's estimation, she felt they were coarse and unfeminine. She didn't understand that they were survivors and fierce mama bears, not until much later in life. Imagine her joy, pure ambrosia, when she gave birth to not one, but a pair of beautiful daughters. My gosh, girls! She pictured fluffy curls and pinafores and dollies for her daughters. She got exactly what she conjured with Lena. Lena was born the day before her due date. She was the first grandbaby on both sides of their family, the Fallon-Brecht side and the Ashners, and everyone doted on the little girl. Lena smiled. She slept soundly and wasn't fussy. She took to the bottle right away as a baby, then, as she grew up, she was tidy and well-mannered and so easy to care for. Irene loved being a mom and prided herself on how dedicated she was to her daughter. She felt her heart opening wider and wider with every passing day of parenthood. She let Bibi and Poppy into their lives more during Lena's formative years, and she started to soften toward Jeanette. After all, Ma was a hard worker and kept her 5 wild children at bay. She must have done something right. Irene was especially touched, remembering how kind her mother was to Vonda. Vonda's mom passed away from breast cancer when the kids were 11, and Jeanette always welcomed the girl and treated her as her own. Irene's grandma passed away during the year that Lena was 2. When Irene was growing up, Greta's diner often meant the difference between her and her brothers having a meal or not. As a mom, she grew to appreciate things that she used to judge. Irene also knew she was lucky. She insisted upon having a tubal ligation immediately after Eva's birth. That baby was 17 days late, and Irene could already picture a harder time with the new infant. She didn't discuss the procedure with Saul. She simply told him afterward while bottle feeding Eva, as they watched the dating game on the hospital television. It was done, and that's all there was to it. She planned to stop with 2 daughters because God knows if they'd tempted fate, a damn boy would have eventually shot out of her. As Eva grew, there were signs of trouble ahead. Irene suspected that her second daughter might turn into a tomboy. Wouldn't stay in a dress no matter how Irene would implore the child. Ripped knees in her trousers and scuffed shoes, and always, always a rat's nest in her black curls. Irene's heart cracked at the thought of another girl in her life that emulated a man. It worsened. She suspected that her daughter had serious emotional problems. Eva's strange behavior began when she was 3, talking to imaginary friends, insomnia, tantrums. That following summer, Eva started to experience fugue-like spells. She would walk over to the linen closet, pull one towel out, and run into the living room where she would toss the towel into a corner of the room. Then she'd run again to the closet and take another, one by one, over and over again, obsessively. By the start of preschool, she was having crying jags, great gulping fits of distress. She hit others, too. The first doctor they saw dismissed their worries. She's trying to get your attention. Saul and Irene were told to ignore Eva's behavior. There were things that Irene said that year to her daughter that she would regret for the rest of her days. The second doctor told the Ashners their daughter had a hormone imbalance and put her on Benzedrine. With that came somnambulance and surliness. There was no more running around the house, no bouncing upon the bed. The grandparents, both Saul's folks and Grandma Jeanette, were aghast. Eva was taken off the medication 6 weeks later at her father's insistence. The third doctor finally discovered the heart of the matter. He said Eva might be mildly autistic and encouraged the Ashners to enroll her in programs that would bring out her creativity and strengthen her developmental skills. It worked. It was just in time as well. The problems were brought under control. But it was during those 2 years of difficulty that the family became aware of another troublesome situation. It was Bibi. It was obvious that she was deeply uncomfortable being around her youngest granddaughter. She seemed almost repulsed by the strange fits. The young family enjoyed spending weekends at Poppy and Bibi's, but that grew difficult during those months. Bibi was absolutely anxious of being with Eva, and even refused to be alone with her granddaughter once, although only Poppy was aware of this incident. Irene and Solomon's second child would always be a little boisterous, opinionated, attention-seeking, but whatever Eva's imbalances were, the worst was behind her in early '76. She turned 6 the week after that Valentine's Day. By that season, Irene and Saul had also softened considerably when it came to accepting gifts and money from his parents. After all, baby furniture was expensive. Doctor's visits were always twice as high as expected. And when Saul needed a new car, they weren't too proud to mention it in front of Poppy, knowing that he'd buy something they would never have dreamt of owning. Saul and Irene came around to the idea, as well, of medical school. Saul went over to Wayne State University and met with the dean of admissions. He talked with him about their pre-med program and picked up an application. This was right after the new year. Maybe by fall, they were thinking. One Friday morning at the end of March 1976, Saul departed for work in a gray suit with a wide green tie. He kissed his wife goodbye, but the girls were dawdling that morning in their bedroom, and he only had time to shout, "Love my girls," as he darted out the door. He worked a long, full day that Friday, and he was looking forward to the weekend ahead. His parents were going to take the girls, and he and Irene would enjoy a much-needed romantic night together. They were going to Chuck Muir's for dinner, and then to catch the new Mel Brooks movie. He knew that once Irene got the kids off to school, she would drive to the neighborhood salon to be washed and styled and set. His daughters were growing up so fast. Lena turned 9 the previous November, and Eva was 6 years old. The winter had been tough. There was a major snowstorm that February, and they lost power at the house for 3 days. They went back and forth between Irene's brothers and Saul's folks. But spring was here now, and life was good. Both daughters were happy and healthy, and everyone was looking forward to the coming summer. His relationship with his parents was also never better. Although they'd only begun to discuss the notion of going to college, Saul understood that Poppy and Beatrice wanted the best for their son. and he wanted the best for his own daughters. He had no sense of compromise. It was right to refuse his father's money when he and Irene first married, and it was suitable to now accept their generosity. Saul and Irene accepted their own financial limitations in the face of raising children without an education. Now he looked forward to his girls growing up in comfort and the exciting new challenge of going back to school. He was energized, enthused about all that lay ahead. He got stuck at work late that evening. Saul didn't grumble. He would have to rush home to get Irene, who would be in her long floral dress, her hair up and her nails manicured. He finished at 5:47 p.m., grabbed his jacket, briefcase, and keys, and practically tumbled down the steps of the professional building where he had spent the past several years building his reputation as a salesman for medical supplies. The cusp of spring, it had lightly snowed the night before, followed by a mid-afternoon rain squall. The sun was still setting early. On the Chrysler freeway, driving 80 miles an hour, Saul scratched his mustache and heard the sound of zipping tires against the slick roads as he raced toward home, listening to an 8-track tape of Wings, Band on the Run. He wrecked 20 minutes into his drive. The beautiful banana yellow sports car was a mangled mess, twisted into the median. Passers-by slowed, gawking at the pool of blood on the highway, illuminated by the freeway overhead lights. Some genuflected as their cars crawled past. Irene waited for her husband past the 6 o'clock arrival she expected. She poured herself a glass of brandy as she waited for Saul to pull up. She put on a Boz Scaggs record. At 7 o'clock she took off her heels and sat on the arm of the sofa, listening to the cuckoo clock chime near the foyer where she hung the silvered wallpaper only the weekend before, the foyer she kissed her husband that very morning. At 8 o'clock she was pacing, chain-smoking her Benson and Hedges. There were sherbet-colored lipstick stains on the filters, each cigarette smoked down to the last drag. At 9 o'clock her hair was a fright, and mascara was pooled around her eyes, wasted with tears and the constant wiping of nervous hands. She had picked at her flawless manicure, revealing angry and red flesh on the cuticles of both thumbs. She'd drunk her second brandy of the night and debated calling her in-laws. At 10 o'clock she was sitting on the kitchen floor, having polished off another glass and a half of brandy and smoked 6 more cigarettes. 3 minutes past the hour, the red and blue sweep of a squad car sent her racing through the kitchen, through the foyer, to the front door. They came inside, the 2 policemen, a black cop and a white cop, to tell her that, "Ma'am, we're so sorry. There's been a terrible accident," and that Irene was a widow at 28 years old. She was listening to them, or trying to, when suddenly the alcohol and nicotine she consumed began to crash and churn in her stomach, and she barely had the chance to blurt out, "Oh no, excuse me," and raced down the hall to the bathroom, when up came the brandy. The officers had the good grace not to follow her into the bathroom, but when she finished and stepped across the threshold, the black police officer reached across to take her elbow and assisted her to the sofa. She fell into the green velour, lit one last B&H for the night, and exhaled a horrible, gasping sigh. When the officers left, she debated waiting until morning to call her in-laws and her daughters. It was almost 11 o'clock, and there was nothing anyone could do at this time of night. Likely the girls were already asleep, and she'd have wakened Lena and Eva for what? The worst news they'd ever receive? She knew how bad her mother-in-law's reaction would be, and Irene dreaded that most of all. But she also knew that she'd have the Ashners' eternal wrath, their caustic and deserved wrath, to deal with if she failed to call them right away. The kids weren't asleep, it turned out. They were up with their grandparents in the den. They were watching Benny Hill and eating bumpy cake. It was Lena's favorite. Lena would remember that one detail from that night, and it forever destroyed the joy of one of her favorite childhood treats. Poppy answered the phone, and Irene was so grateful for that. As much as she feared her father-in-law, she knew that telling him would be mercifully easier than telling Beatrice. She reckoned that he would tell the girls too in the right way. She wasn't even sure that she trusted herself to do that. Lena and Eva were brought home that night. Eva was sleeping, and Lena was not. Lena was angry, sulky, and her eyes were so gummed over with the ache of hard tears that she had trouble with her eyesight for days. Poppy carried Eva, breathing heavily and curled in slumber, from the car and transferred her into her mommy's arms. Irene tucked the child, wearing her sweet little pink pajama set, into her own king-size bed. Beatrice remained seated, her menthol cigarette hanging out the slimmest crack of the passenger side window. Part of Irene wanted to reach out to her mother-in-law, to the woman that she knew loved Solly even more than she did, but she was afraid. She saw Bibi, her face turned away, gray under the moonlight. The big blue Oldsmobile looked ghastly, parked within the driveway shadows like a hearse. There was a swirl of smoke enveloping Beatrice, poison smoke that would someday eat her lungs black. Poppy kissed sullen and sleepy Lena and told her to be a good girl, wash her face, and go to sleep for her mama. Then, in an uncharacteristic embrace, he was always more of a kisser than a hugger, he clutched Irene and promised, "We'll get through this." Irene loved her father-in-law for this. She understood that this was a gift. She tried to remember that thought and his embrace and his own loss during the next few years as her own life evolved and her dependence upon the Ashners and their money grew unbearable for her. Sometimes it was hard to remember that her wonderful husband came from that duplicitous life. She continued to live in their house in Lathrop Village. Saul had a small life insurance plan, and Poppy supplemented her finances. It was easiest on her that way, initially. She could wallow in her grief and simply miss her husband. But her mother wouldn't let her off that easy. Jeanette brought her daughter up to stand on her own 2 feet. She had no beef with the Ashners, frankly. She respected them and found both Poppy and Beatrice to be good co-grandparents. But she didn't raise her daughter to be on the goddamn dole. Lena and Eva, Jeanette reprimanded Irene, needed their mother to be strong. It wasn't long before Irene concurred with Jeanette. Her children were growing older and would soon learn who Michael Ashner was. She decided that she needed to grow independent of Poppy and Beatrice and the reputation that still surrounded her in-laws. 10 months after Saul's accident, she joined a support group for widows. She reached out to Vonda, whom she distanced from in recent years. In April of '77, Irene got her first real job. It was at a small independent bookstore in Berkeley. The bookstore was owned by Dixie, an ardent feminist from Toronto with a pasty, owlish appearance and a fat butt. Dixie introduced Irene to many of her women friends. She hosted potlucks and discussions late at night at the bookstore. Irene was now making her own money, but still taking a monthly stipend from Poppy. She was meeting new people, new acquaintances. The women in her life included domestic abuse victims, single moms, and frustrated lesbians. She went out some evenings and left the kids with Vonda or her mom. She started to avoid her in-laws. Nobody quite understood what was happening. Not Irene's mom or brothers, not her best friend, certainly not her daughters. She started going braless. She stopped highlighting her hair. She made healthy casseroles and took them to meetings where her friends read Our Bodies, Ourselves and The Second Sex. She switched from cocktails to wine, cheap wine out of paper cups. She dressed, as Bibi put it, like a schmuck in those damn blue jeans. Irene tried to spend more time with Vonda. She felt that they should have a more mature relationship now that they were in their 30s, but Vonda just got on her nerves. Irene was loath to admit that Vonda Piascoa embarrassed her. Her new friends worked her over good once she told them who her father-in-law was. "You gonna let a gangster raise your kids?" she was asked over and over. She grew to feel self-conscious about showing off the nice things she acquired during her marriage, things she bought with Solomon, gifts that her husband gave her. She started to save $5 here, $10 there. She went on food stamps and took the money that Poppy gave her for groceries and squirreled it away in her savings account. By the summer of '79, when Lena was 12 and Eva was 9, she had over $500 saved. She told nobody, including her folks, about her plans. On the last day of school that June, Lena and Eva skipped home together from class to find their mom in the driveway, waiting for her daughters. Irene was sitting on the back bumper of her orange Pinto, wearing big tinted sunglasses and a determined but dreamy look on her face. Their summer clothes were packed into suitcases in the hatch. Irene grinned and told the girls to get in. "We're going on vacation." They didn't return to Detroit for more than 2 years.